Yes, hello one and all. And to tell you that the second Serie A Derby d'Italia of the season was Inter 3, Juventus 2, should excite you a little bit, but it won't excite you any much as near as to what is necessary, will it, Nicky? Because there is so much else going on. Because our top line, as I hinted at the beginning, should really be that Inter have finally beat one of the other big teams, because despite their substantial and growing lead at the top of Serie A in recent weeks, the biggest they've managed to knock over so far is Roma. They hadn't managed to beat Juventus, they hadn't managed to beat Milan, they hadn't managed to beat Napoli. They lost away at Stadio Diego Armando Maradona going back a couple of months, and they finally get it over the line against Juve in that match that they really want to win in this or any season. But it's not just one but, though, is it?
Well, I mean, first of all, just to pick up what you said, Andy, you talk about them not, I think one of those games recently, it's actually been 14 games in a row against those clubs, Napoli, Milan, Juventus, they hadn't won any of them. So it's been a long time coming. But I mean, Giorgio Chiellini said after the game that we can't talk about football today. I don't know if we're 2 days on now, so perhaps we can talk about football today, but we couldn't talk about it on Saturday. No talking
right, goodbye.
about
It's been great to see you.
on Saturday, because, of course, this game was so overshadowed by the red card to Pierre Kalulu just before half-time. I think probably most people listening to this would have seen it by now, but in case anyone hasn't, it's the 42nd minute, I think it is, certainly right before half-time. And you've got Juventus coming forward, but Alessandro Bastoni steals the ball and is heading forward with it. Kalulu comes across him and looks like he's about to foul him, to be honest. Realizes at the last second he's going to be late in this challenge, doesn't put his foot in at all, but he has got a hand that brushes Bastoni, I think we can say. There is some contact, it appears. And the referee sees this and immediately gives a second yellow to Kalulu, sends him off. And this game that has been so finely poised in the first half at 1-1. I think I would say Juventus were the better side in the first half at 1-1. Suddenly has this complete shift in its dynamic, because now you're going to have Inter being on 11 players against Juventus 10. Now, well, I'm sure we'll talk about the specifics of this contact. To me, it's in the spectrum between exaggeration and outright simulation. We're a lot closer to simulation than we are to exaggeration, to me, because the contact is so minimal, and the way that Bastoni goes down, it is he really like digs his left foot into the floor to make it look like he's been clipped at a foot level, which he isn't at all. There's no contact between their feet, and he twists in the air, and then he gets up, waving a yellow card immediately, an imaginary card in his hand. So he does everything to get the decision. But the second significant thread off that is just the fact that Bastoni himself is on a yellow card. So if the referee sees it, as I saw it, as I think a lot of people saw it, as indeed the refereeing designated Gianluca Rocchi saw it, because after the game he came out and said this was wrong. He said that the referee La Penna was mortified about it, and that it was a wrong decision. So if it had been seen the way lots of us saw it, it would have been Bastoni going off and Kalulu staying on, and that would have been for certain a completely different game if Inter were playing on 10 in the second half and Juventus playing on 11.
Yeah, it would have been, and especially with the context of how Juventus played in that first half, as you said, Nicky, a Cambiaso on goal, giving the lead to Inter rather against the run of play, and then Cambiaso a few minutes later coming up the other end and scoring himself to get on both sides of the score sheet and level it up was the least that Inter deserved at that point. And maybe a little reminder that Luis Enrique, who'd been involved in that first goal, is not quite a defender. That he's the more attacking side of wing backs, as he was quite statuesque as Cambiaso ghosted in to score, sort of Marcus Trescothic-esque foot movement, I suppose you could say, to let Cambiaso get that equaliser. And it was a shame for the spectacle, although the way that Juventus played in the second half didn't make it feel as if it was as unbalanced as it could have been at that moment.
I think, if anything, Andy, for the spectacle, if we take aside fans' perspectives, because of course fans want their team to win, or at least fans of two clubs, the neutral fans maybe not. If we take aside that, I think for the spectacle, it probably would have been less of a spectacle if it had gone the way it should have done. If it had been Bastoni sent off, I'm not certain we would have got as good of a game, because I think Inter would have approached that very differently. I think there's absolutely a lot that needs to be said, and I hope we'll say some of it about how courageously Juventus approached this game from the start and then continued to in the second half. And how much quality they showed at different times throughout the game. Because, I mean, actually, I think even before the sending off, you've already alluded to it there with Henrique and one attacking wing back he is. I think you could say on the other side, Di Marco is hardly a defensive wing back, but Inter were forced into playing the first half of this game on the back foot, because Spalletti, frankly, just had a better shape for Juventus. They were far more well considered in the way they were pressing. They were really dominating the middle of the pitch, but they were also just, whenever they had the ball, getting past Inter's press really, really effectively. You saw Locatelli dropping into the defence, and then you've got so many angles on the right side of the pitch in particular, because you had Kalulu, McKennie and Conceição all occupying spaces in that side of the pitch that, with Locatelli dropping and drawing Sucic onto him, was just creating all this space. They didn't know where to go. So the first half, I thought Spalletti was a real victory for Spalletti in terms of just the tactics of it. And I think that several Juventus players came out of that really well in terms of individual performances as well. I think McKennie has been having a fantastic season and was really doing a nice job there. But I think that the mindset of Juventus, even after they go a player down, and in the second half, then a goal down as well, is definitely worth commenting on.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm dragging us away from the main talking point of the game, which is Kalulu and Bastoni. I don't really want to, because there's so many other brilliant things to talk about in this game. But I guess before we completely leave that, what I would like to ask is what you think will be the upshot of this, because it does feel like, because this happened in such a big game, that this is something that will have to affect change going forward in Serie A and Italian football. And I was describing this on TalkSport last night, actually, and I was saying that the curious thing about VAR, and of course, VAR couldn't go back and reanalyze and correct this, because they're not allowed to get involved in yellow cards, although there are ways and means, I would suggest. And, I think quite how the technology is employed. I mean, we've seen it overstep the mark on several occasions in several different countries beyond the initially stated clear and obvious. I thought it was quite interesting, actually, hearing Patrick Kendrick on the World Feed commentary saying contrast it to the Napoli-Como game in the Coppa Italia in the week, where Jacobo Ramon of Como could have got a second yellow card, and the referee just took a breath, had to think about it, and then decided from there. The card was out very, very quickly for Kalulu. And if you think Lapana's made an error, it's probably the haste with which he reacted. But of course, I think the other thing to point out is VAR needs to be different things to different footballing nations. And that's something that we can overlook sometimes. Whereas in England, and often we have a largely English audience, or a majority English audience listening to this. What we want to take from VAR in England, the reason we've never quite got on with VAR in the Premier League, I guess, is because what we need from it is just that, to get rid of the clear and obvious errors. But we don't like minutiae, I pointed out. We think it messes with the flow. We think it messes with the spirit of the game. And that's not the way it's looked at in Italy or Portugal, for example, where transparency is important. And that is the most important thing. So I guess that the question I would have, Nicky, if we were going to go and analyse yellow cards, what does that do to the flow of the game? Does that break that up even more? Do you have to put it in a situation where you have, say, this coach's challenge? So Spalletti could have had a look on his iPad and put his arm up and said, okay, we need you to look at this. Where do you think it should go, and where do you think it will go?
First thing to say, I think, is that this rule is absolutely changing. So the reason this doesn't get reviewed, just to be completely clear, is because the VAR regulations do not currently permit reviewing of second booking offences. IFAB have already recommended in January for that to change, recommended for that to change, as well as also for VAR news to be permitted on corner decisions. And the expectation is that those will come into effect for the World Cup this summer. So this is a current situation that is not going to be a long-term situation, it appears. Whether or not everyone's going to be delighted about some of those changes, as you say, Andy. I mean, I think in England, there's so much conversation about VAR interrupting the game, and corners, while they can be really important, I'm thinking to myself, are we going to have long pauses over corners? Is everyone going to be happy about that? And Pierluigi Collina has spoken about this. The real need is for a lot of these decisions just to happen quicker, one way or another, because I think that it's one thing for there to be some oversight. And I think actually probably most people, maybe I'm wrong, but I think most people support at this point there being some oversight, but it's the long pauses that kill everyone. I thought what was interesting after this game, actually, Andy, was I saw Daniele De Rossi, who just a week ago was having his own extreme frustration about VAR that was used to give
Napoli... You can say meltdown.
To give Napoli a penalty after a light contact on Antonio Vergara in the box. I saw him saying after this game, well, the one good thing about this is people will actually see it because it's in Inter against Juventus. And I thought to myself, this is one of those moments where, not wanting to make this about me, but I'm like, I did write about your decision in The Guardian. I mean, that I'm not meaning to be like, but we are the media. The media are actually writing about these things. You weren't ignored. Like, it's a bit one of those narratives everyone likes to say, the man won't tell you this, but like actually like the newspapers are covering it, right? Like it's, I do think it was an interesting set of reactions to this incident. And I do think when I take a step back from it, I find some of them a little bit overblown. I mean, it's a bad decision in a big game, right? And we're suddenly acting that that's never happened before, as if it isn't. The whole history of football is people getting angry about these big decisions. But for certain, it felt very unsatisfying that a decision where everyone, I think really everyone who's not a pretty partisan Inter fan looked at this decision and thought, well, that's wrong, isn't it? And like you say, I think the referee could certainly show some discretion in that situation and say, this is a right before halftime in a really big game. Does this need to be a red card? But at the same time, though, the referee's job is not necessarily to make those judgment calls. Referee's job is to get the decision right. And if he thought that was what Bastoni made it look like, which is Kalulu coming across, kicking his foot as he's trying to launch a counterattack, that is a bookable offence. If you see it as what Bastoni wanted it to be, it's a bookable offence. And I suppose I have a lot of sympathy for the referee as well in that situation. They're making a snap decision, and without the option of going to VAR, they're going to make those wrong decisions sometimes.
Of course, if we get past the dive itself, the fact that Bastoni was brandishing his imaginary yellow card would have been a yellow card offence in itself, perhaps. But let's leave that there and talk about the game itself. And let's go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, about Inter's inability, and this extraordinary inability, to knock over their direct rivals, or the teams that we generally perceive as their direct rivals. Now, it's funny because I saw a couple of games in the flesh when they played Milan last season, and they were games that I felt that Inter had in control for large parts of them. Just to remind you, when you talked about that run of 14, they played Milan 5 times last season and didn't win any of them, which is pretty extraordinary. We've said that before on the show, and I'm sure we'll say it again because it's mad, and it's one of those things. I kind of feel like the ancient mariner with his albatross. You have to keep saying it out loud to get it off your chest. But I think they dominated quite a bit of those games, and it felt like they had it in hand until they didn't. Whereas this is completely the opposite. And from Christian Kivu's perspective, you'd definitely rather have the thin end of the wedge in terms of play, in terms of flow of the game, and manage to get it over the line. Now, funnily enough, even though Juventus gave this creditable performance when it was 11 against 11 in the first half, but particularly impressive was the way that they continued to search for a goal, not just when they were a goal down in the second half, but when it was level. I thought they were really, really positive and enterprising, not just well organised defensively, but more than that. But what would really please me if I was Christian Kivu, that as the physical level of Juventus started to drop a little bit, Inter just started to chip away, didn't they, in those last 20 minutes? And even though it never really felt as if they had Juve under siege, it wasn't completely unexpected that they found a way, first through Pio Esposito and secondly through Zielinski. I guess let's start with Pio Esposito because he has been the find of the Club World Cup last summer, which enabled him to stay at Inter. Their bench is so much better this season, not on paper, but in reality. And if there's something that's going to make Inter go on and win the title and be a contender for the Coppa Italia and the Champions League all over again, and I see no reason why that shouldn't be the case, it's going to be the depth of that bench, isn't it?
I do see a reason why it shouldn't be the case, and I think it's that they just don't defend well enough. They just don't, and I think that's become a problem for them under Kivu, and perhaps was already becoming a problem before under Inzaghi. I mean, obviously they conceded a lot of goals late in the Champions League last season, but I think it's getting worse. I think that they are. I think they're not tactically as clever as they should be. I think when you look at this game, to me, to come back to what I said in the first half, I think that it was odd because Juventus, for me, were definitely the better side in the first half, but Inter might still have been the more dangerous. And the reason for that is because you've got Thuram and Lautaro up top. And when you've got Thuram and Lautaro up top, you're pretty scary. And what's, I think your part of your point just there is that, and now you've got Pio Esposito off the bench, who, frankly, I think is going to start creating problems for Kivu in the not distant future about who should be his first choice front two, because he's that good. I think he's really, really looking like he's the business, and that's great news for Italy, by the way, who've been screaming for a strike like this for a long time. But certainly when he came on in the second half, that was a real shift in the dynamic of the game, because actually in the second half, Juventus had solidified the middle of the pitch and were kind of giving Inter that space outside them, and you saw that reflection in how many crosses Inter were putting in, and those crosses didn't look dangerous until Pio Esposito was in there. As soon as Pio Esposito was in there, I think he'd been on the pitch for about a minute when he had his first header that wasn't like a scary header, but it was on target still and demanded a save, and then the goal he does score is a great header.
It is.
So he's offering something different to that attack, which is really, really powerful. But I do think there's no question that Inter have the best depth in Serie A. There's no question that they have that strength, I think, over anyone else in the division, and domestically, they should be winning the league. They, I think, probably are going to win the league. The question is whether or not this win is, as Christian Kivu paints it at the end, is this like now the mental burden is off? We can beat a big team. We can get that little break that we needed, that bit of luck that we needed to get past this hurdle. And now we can go on and start winning these games more regularly, because, I think you can pick plenty of holes in the way they've performed in some of these games. But some of it does start to feel just like, how have you not managed to do it? I mean, even the last game against Juventus was a late turnaround, wasn't it? It was one of those games where you think you know what's happening, and then suddenly Juventus turn it around, and I mean, not to bring it back to the other side again, but Juventus, who was the key player in that first game for them, Kefren Thuram, he was a late exclusion from this game, and that's another little thing that makes a big difference in this match, I think. Yeah,
and you know what? Inter played a lot better in that first game than they played in this.
Yeah,
I felt for large parts of it, and you came away from that thinking, what do they have to do to win one of these top games? On your Pio Esposito point, actually, I do wonder if there is a genuine decision to make, because I tend to think, of course, it feels like Thuram and Lautaro are sort of unbreakable in a way, the best front two in world football, because there are not many front twos in world football. But the way that Lautaro plays an extraordinary amount of football, and the way that Thuram plays the game so incredibly physically, he will get chances if things just continue as the way they are. You're going to need Pio Esposito to step in. Yeah, there is that. But I just think Lautaro is, in some ways, one of the absolute best strikers in the world, but he'll never be able to get that consistency out because of the way he plays the game and because of the volume of minutes that he's played over the last 3 or 4 years, which is extraordinary, really. But let's touch on Juventus a little bit as well. I know there is no, oh, well, there's a lot we can take from the performance after losing a game to Inter right at the end. But especially as we, just to provide a little peek behind the OTC curtain, we were deciding before the weekend whether we were going to do this episode on Juve versus Inter and Napoli versus Roma. And there was so much in this game that we said, like halfway through Sunday, let's just do Juventus versus Inter. As it turned out, Napoli versus Roma was very exciting as well, though maybe not quite to this level. But with the way that Juventus played in this, Nicky, and with the way it shook out between Napoli and Roma, which was a very pleasing game, but underlined some of the faults and weaknesses of both of those teams as well. If you're Luciano Spalletti, are you thinking we're in a good position to qualify for the Champions League, despite the fact that this string of results actually led to them dropping out of the top 4 by a point?
Yeah, I've thought for a little while they seem more to be trending in the right direction than some of the teams above them. Certainly the Napoli with their injury crisis that keeps mounting up. Although, as you allude to with that, talk about that game, Napoli showed some real character not to lose that game after falling behind in the second half to Roma as well. So I think all of these teams have some arguments to make for them and against them. And indeed, there's teams behind them who are still in this conversation as well, including Atalanta and Como. So it's going to be a very, very tight race for that top 4. I think that what I would certainly feel looking at Juventus is just they are a drastically different proposition to what they were at the start of the season under Igor Tudor, and what they have been, in my opinion, for a while. I think Spalletti has brought a level of dynamism and a level of fluidity in the way that they play that we hadn't seen there for a while. I think Juventus had been often incredibly boring to watch, which was interesting that was true, of course, under Thiago Motta, who's brought in as this guy who we all thought was one of the great innovative new minds coming through in European football, and we thought he was going to break that mold, and he didn't. But I think if you contrast it to that, how they were under him, they were, I think, I don't have the numbers because it's a while ago, but I'm sure they had something like the most touches per shot of any team in Serie A, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Like you're taking a lot of touches, but it tells you something about the way you're playing. It's very slow build-up play. And Igor Tudor already shifted that a bit because Tudor is all about getting straight to those shots, not wasting time. It's just that Igor Tudor never quite made them look brilliant. He made them more direct and sometimes more functional, but it was never elevated football, I would say. And then when they ran out of steam at the end, they really ran out of steam and had that long run of disappointing results. It feels to me like Spalletti is really tapping into the way individual players that he's got work. He certainly understands Jonathan David in a way that wasn't happening under Igor Tudor. I do feel like Weston McKennie, who I touched on, has been permitted to play in a way that's fitting him much better. He's notionally part of that midfield, but he's really pushing on to be more like a number 10 and in what becomes a very attacking formation, by the way, when you look at Conceição, McKennie and Yildiz all behind an attacker. It sometimes looks almost like a 4-2-4. It's really like an ambitious shape compared to some of what we've seen from Juventus in the last few years. So I think that there is a team coming together under Spalletti, and I think that certainly the mindset from this game is something that you take away as a positive, because 2-1 down on 10 men with a quarter of an hour left, I think that's over. I think, okay, well, it's taken a while, but Inter have got their goal and we're done here. And then they score really, really a lovely equaliser. One of those moments where you think to yourself, how exactly is he there? But Bremer, who suddenly got his back to goal, I mean, there was a moment that made me think, could Bremer be like a target man number 9? Because he plays that ball so well. First time to McKennie. McKennie puts it in, and then Locatelli, who I thought put in a real leader's performance in this game, really absolutely stood out as trying to drag his team on, scores a brilliant goal. I mean, brilliant's overstating it, but I thought it was a really nice finish into the bottom corner. Not everyone can hit that shot at all across his body. And even then, when you see the winner for Inter, Locatelli is throwing himself in front of it. He is doing everything he can to get in front of it. I think that Juventus have got, if they can find it to see it that way, they've got a chance to look at this game and go, you know what, we really actually pushed against adversity really bloody hard, and against the best team in Italy, we gave a great account of ourselves, and we can go on and get more good results after this, which of course they get the chance to do almost immediately because they've got the Champions League playoff round game against Galatasaray on Tuesday night.
Yeah, no tractors allowed. I think Antonio Conte still has nightmares about that one. Juventus have got a bit of history against Galatasaray at that stadium in Istanbul, of course. And it's a really interesting prospect. But it does feel like Juve are in good shape for it. And I guess, Nicky, I wanted to ask you, because we've been talking so much about Igor Tudor in recent days, of course, with him being parachuted into Tottenham, a surprise to many, a surprise to me, even though you can, I think, make a case for why it makes sense, particularly in the way that he's been parachuted into Juventus and parachuted into Lazio at not dissimilar times in the season. When we talk about how Tudor turned around the back end of last season from that quite slow, ponderous football played under Thiago Motta and delivered Juventus safely to the Champions League, he parlayed that into an extension, of course. How much do you think Tudor was the victim of the hand he was dealt? Firstly, in the fact that he was definitely one of those coaches who could have done without the Club World Cup. I think you can put Inter in that bracket as well. And I think you can certainly put Xabi Alonso. It was a sort of unwelcome false start to his spell at Real Madrid. And how much do you feel he was a victim of circumstance? And this feels like an Antonio Conte moan, actually. But in terms of the amount of forward players that were dropped on him at the start of the season, it was never going to be easy. You talked about Juventus being a very attacking side when they're going forward with the freedom that McKennie's got, with Yildiz, with Conceição, with David. But of course, we're not even mentioning Dusan Vlahovic, who may be leaving at the end of the season, but he will be replaced, of course. And Lois Openda, who Juventus seem to have bought but have no idea what to do with. And you're talking about a consistent top 5 leagues regular scorer who's been great for a number of seasons for Lens and Leipzig at a very good level. And now that he's a problem they need to fix. I mean, is it really, if we're looking at Igor Tudor and what went wrong for him in the first half of the season, which I think will interest Spurs fans at the very least, how much of that was to do with circumstance?
Yeah, I think you can't say that Tudor was, I suppose, thrown into an awful situation, because he fought really hard to be in that awful situation. You know, he was demanding a contract extension. So he was the one saying he didn't want to lead the Club World Cup without a contract extension on the table first. So you can't say that he was dragged into this kicking and screaming, but it definitely felt like one of those situations where it's never going to be an ideal setup for a manager when your bosses have been really openly courting other people, and then they come back to you and go, okay, you can keep the job. Because there was really open pursuit of several other managers. Obviously, there was a talk with Antonio Conte, who just won the league at Napoli, and then decided to say they spoke to Gianpiero Gasperini, who ends up taking the Roma job. There was certainly noise that they tried to approach Cesc Fabregas as well at Como, and obviously Como able to dig their heels in and say, no, he's going nowhere. But I think there's almost 2 levels to that. One of which is, gosh, you're asking everyone else before you ask the guy you've already got. And secondly, like, those aren't even particularly similar managers. And I think that's never a good sign when your approach to hiring your next manager is not what kind of manager do we want, but just where's the shiny thing? Yeah, like, where's the shiny thing that we can get? So it was not a particularly planned summer. And Tudor definitely did not get to keep, let alone to sign, to keep all the players he wanted. He was actually getting a good tune out of Muani, which of course is now at Tottenham, which will be interesting to see if he can work that out. But that was the striker he wanted back, and instead he gets 2 completely different strikers, and not, you know, David and Openda. They're not similar strikers either. They're different kinds of striker, and so you're remaking this puzzle on the fly. Your summer has been disrupted by the fact that you've had to go and do the Club World Cup, which you did with Muani. So you've already got, again, not the preparation coming in that you wanted to. I think it's not right to absolve him of blame either. And I think the kind of the final nail in the coffin, it felt like, for Tudor at Juventus is when they're losing to Como and he's saying, well, Cesc Fabregas got to sign whoever we like. And do you know what? Maybe that's true that Fabregas got more say over transfer policy. But you just can't be Juventus saying Como are the big club, we're the small club. Even though Como have the money, they do. You just can't beat Juventus and do that. So he has to take ownership of that as well. But I think that it wasn't an easy job at the start of the season. I think that's actually why it's so impressive how Spalletti's doing, because it's not an easy job now. But Spalletti is making it look very different to how it looked under Tudor and indeed Thiago Motta before him. And Motta really did get everything he wanted. And you know, when you talk about leadership, actually, frankly, to spin it back to where we started this podcast, none of Juventus's players or Spalletti spoke after the game on Saturday, and that's fair enough. I think sometimes when people are angry, it's better not to speak. But the decision was clearly made that instead, Damian Camoli, who's the general manager there, and Chiellini come and speak to the press. And look, at half time of this game, Camoli had to be physically pushed away from getting into the referee's face by Spalletti. Spalletti had been talking to the referee quite heatedly. And then even Spalletti realized in that moment, you need to be taken away. That's not... On the one hand, I think there is leadership in the directors coming down and speaking and saying, we're going to protect the manager now. We'll take this conversation so the manager doesn't get himself in trouble. But it shouldn't be a half time your manager is having to lead a director away from the referee. That's not how that's supposed to go, I don't think. So, yeah, I think the leadership at the club has been not always what it could be. Let's put it that way, I suppose.
Yeah, this is why conversation is good, because I'd not even considered the bit that Igor Tudor might get a real tune out of Randal Kolo Muani at Spurs, and that might be the thing that saved their season. And who knows, maybe even gets them to another Champions League final. Weirder stuff has happened. Not much weirder stuff, but weirder stuff has happened. We'll see if Kolo Muani ends up in the white of Spurs or Bianconeri next season. But before we leave this, Nicky, I'm not going to ask you for a prediction of are Inter going to win the league, because I think we have our answer to that from this game. What I am going to ask you for in a non-binding prediction, so don't worry too much, is what is your top four? I will start by giving you mine to take a little bit of the pressure off. I think the eventual top four in this order is Inter, Milan, Juventus, Roma. And that is despite the fact that, as you said, so much of what Napoli did last night showed how tigerish they are, and adding to that, of course, the emergence of Alisson Santos. But yeah, you go for it. Give me your top four.
I'm worried I'm going to say the same ones you did. I mean, not just Santos, by the way, but Vergara as well has been pretty nice for Napoli in the last few weeks. They have found resources that they didn't necessarily think they had. I think Inter and Milan I feel pretty confident that it's going to be the top two. And I don't think the title race is over, because Milan, if they win the game in hand, they're going to be just 5 points behind, and they still have to play Inter, right? So if Inter haven't solved this crisis of never being able to beat the big clubs, in theory that gap can get smaller. The thing is just that Inter beat everyone else. Inter have won 20 games out of 25 this season. They're actually I think in the last 14 games, the only one they haven't won was the draw with Napoli. So they are flying, really, when you look at it. So I do think Inter win. I think Milan have been pretty steadily on course for that second place spot. And the thing with Milan, which makes you feel confident about, is they just don't concede that many goals, and that makes them steady. And for the same reason, I think Roma are going to make it in as well, because they don't concede many goals. And because now they've got Daniel Marlin, who was great again against Napoli, who I think has really changed the dynamic for them up front. And I think that between those two things, barring, for instance, Marlin getting injured, because I do think he has been that impactful already that he is important to this picture, but I think they are good enough to be in the top four. So then that brings it down to me to a call between Juventus and Napoli. And Napoli, all sorts of spirit, and perhaps perhaps now they're out of the Champions League, just having that lighter schedule will allow Antonio Conte to do what he does and just produce a league team that is going to grind out those results and get them. I certainly wouldn't rule it out. But the momentum of injuries, the amount of players they have lost, and as much as we all like to tease Conte for complaining, I think he has got a reasonable complaint this season about some of the luck they've had on that front.
It's unprecedented. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that tips it for me in Juventus' favour. But maybe my only difference is from your top four to mine is I think maybe I see Roma as the slightly safer of the other ones in my head. But I don't think it's a done deal. I do think that while I think I'm falling on the same four as you, I wouldn't put my house in it, put it that way. I think it's definitely possible that any of those other teams we've mentioned, and I do include Como in that, of course, beat Napoli on penalties the other day. I do think that they could, that any of those teams could yet find it into the top four, depending on how things like injuries shake out in the last part of the season.